Avinu Malkeinu, Chanenu Vaneinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Chanenu Vaneinu, Ki ein banu masim, Aseh imanu, tzedakah v'chesed, Aseh imanu, tzedakah v'chesed, v'hoshienu. That melody, with those words, evoke some of my most meaningful childhood recollections of being in shul during the Yamim Noraim, the high holidays. And it feels right to sing today, because today is Yom HaZikaron, a day of remembrance. The Torah identifies the first day of Tishrei, today, it's the 7th month, as Zichron Teruah, a day for remembering loud blasts. What blasts? The sacred blasts that our pagan predecessors would sound annually at the end of the harvest season as part of the coronation ceremonies for their multiple gods. This ceremony was understood as essential to set in motion a successful harvest for the following year. The pagan roots of this Day of Loud Blasts is undeniable. The Torah gives us very little information about why the first of Tishrei is important or what we should actually do. But Rabbinic Judaism cleverly reformulated how we understand its description as Zichron Teruah, a day of remembering loud blasts, by developing the 3 themes of the day: kingship, loud blasts, and remembrance. This thematic trilogy is apparent in all of the liturgical editions throughout Rosh Hahshanah services and found most prominently in the 3 extraordinary sections of the Musaf service: Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, each chock full of biblical references to the one and only King, the capacity for this King to remember us during times of need, and how the shofar heralds and praises this King. King, 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 king. And of course, it's to drive home that the pagan gods weren't king. This is the King. The liturgical nuance is very sophisticated and admittedly cryptic if we're unaware of its precedent. Distilled to its core, however, Rosh Hahshanah is a call to memory. Not only remembering loud blasts, we remember creation. God remembers Sarah and Hannah. We remember our faults and admit our wrongs so that we can wholeheartedly ask to be remembered by God for another year of life. I have big news for you. Everything in Judaism, everything is about memory. 2 chalot every Shabbos meal remembers, among many things, the double portion of manna in the desert. The Passover Seder, reliving the Exodus saga. Sukkot, our very strong agricultural roots. Hanukkah, the power of the Spirit over the sword. Every ritual act in Judaism is connected to some historical event, and sometimes more than one, that has eternal reverberations. As humans, memory is our key to survival. Our personal memories influence everything we do every day. Memory systems enable us to navigate the present and imagine the future. Among other functions, memories help us make sense of the world around us, help us focus our attention and perception, help us make good decisions, help us make helpful predictions, maintain a sense of self, foster our social relationships, navigate environments, and creatively problem solve. Those are just a few things that our memories allow us to do. Since the earliest days of Israelite peoplehood, we have had a foundational story that sets the stage for how we are expected to operate in the world, expected to treat each other, and what we can expect from the God we serve but do not idolize. This foundational story was so essential to our very being that every Israelite had to share this memory by memory every time they came to the temple with the first fruits of their harvest. It may sound familiar to you. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, and there he became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed hard labor upon us. We cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place, and he gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore, I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. This passage, found in chapter 25 of Deuteronomy, is the foundational myth or memory of the Jewish people. Every culture and every religion has a defining myth that supports its mission and value system. Ours is that we were minding our own business as guests in somebody else's home, lived there happily for a while, things turned icky, we got out, found a new home, and every day in that new home, we gave thanks to God for our blessings. The fact that there is no hard archaeological evidence that Jews were ever enslaved in Egypt or had anything to do with building the pyramids or Egypt's ancient cities might be news to some people. There is no question that there were early monotheists living in that region, but when I learned this stunning truth, I was shocked. Had I been lied to all my life? No Jewish slaves in Egypt? You've got to be kidding me. But I ultimately reconcile that the tale of Egyptian slavery contains eternal truths that have been lived out in recorded history for millennia. So allow me to restate the Deuteronomic passage in my own words. This is Torah by Marcia. Our ancestors were eternal wanderers and fugitives, always migrating to somewhere in search of more stable living conditions, religious tolerance, and economic opportunity, often by invitation, sometimes under the radar. From a small group of settlers in each place, Jewish communities grew and sometimes flourished. Depending on where and when, eventually, governmental leaders decided that the answer to failed leadership and economic decline was to blame the Jewish population, usually well integrated into the economy of the place, foment anger and hate among the economically deprived, the undereducated, and the mean people with power, who would then help make life for local Jews untenable and deflect the real issues underlying the problems in that community. At best, Jews would have all their wealth and possessions stripped from them and be expelled with their lives spared from a country that they had lived in and contributed to for decades or centuries. At worst, they were subject to horrible torture and killed in extraordinary numbers in unspeakable ways. A remnant always survived, and these beleaguered few sought refuge in another place somewhere on the planet that allowed them to live, work, and worship in peace, often far away from the home they'd known all their lives. Continued devotion to God through study, ritual practice, tzedakah. These visitors became part of the fabric of their new home and shared their bounty, first fruits, if you will, by setting up institutions that enhanced life and created economic opportunity for all residents, like libraries, hospitals, art centers, universities, charity organizations, and more. This period of relative calm and productivity lasted until a different troubled person ascended to power or something went terribly wrong economically, and leaders figured out from their memory playbook with a host of age-old anti-Semitic tropes to choose from, that the easiest thing to do would be to blame the local Jewish population for the problems they had that had nothing to do with the Jews. And at that point, the cycle of loss, death, and migration would begin again. Now, there's a reason no one asked me to write the Torah, because that was way too long. The story of Jacob is much cleaner. But the story of our fugitive ancestor Jacob has been played out factually throughout Jewish history hundreds of thousands of times in places all over the world in large and small scales. Most we've actually never heard of. I am in awe that the Bible writers knew that this was going to be the way of the world for all time and made sure that every Israelite descendant never forgot it. Now, when the cult ended in 70 CE and there was no longer a place to bring our first fruits, the early rabbis cleverly inserted this must-know passage into the Passover Haggadah, recited every year, so that we'd never forget it, even if we never showed up in shul for Parashat Kitavo when that is read. Now, Jacob's story is a four-part saga that has been played out. Here it is. Jews choose life. Like Jacob, we seek places to settle that are healthy for our families. There was no food in Canaan, so his family packed up and went to Egypt, not knowing what they might find. Number two, Jews plant roots and grow, both in number and capacity, as contributing members of the greater society. Jacob's family had been given land outside the city. There they farmed successfully and built large families over several centuries, maintaining their distinctive tribal identity. Something goes wrong. I don't need to tell you that whole story about what happened in Egypt. And then the Jews leave, either by choice or by force, because they die. Now, in Jacob's story, we did endure pain and suffering for decades, but we had no historical template to follow, so God identified Moses to lead the children of Israel out of the narrow straits to a land of promise. But we are never given a satisfactory reason in the Torah as to why the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, felt the need to oppress the entire hardworking Israelite nation, none of whom did anything he could point to that would harm Egypt. His campaign to destroy the Israelites was based on hypothetical fear. That, too, is prescient. For the countless Jewish expulsions throughout time, there has never, ever been a justifying, valid reason. And that little nagging truth is the truth that no one talks about and that Jews just viscerally understand. In 2021, a collection of essays by novelist Dara Horn was published in a book titled People Love Dead Jews. Here it is. People Love Dead Jews. Every essay is unique and deals with slices of Jewish history that are unrelated except for the recurring theme that Jewish settlers came to a place, helped it flourish, ultimately got kicked out, often with their legacy entirely erased. Lather, rinse, repeat. A celebrated Jewish novelist in her 40s who grew up in a conservative Jewish home, Horn felt compelled to write this book after the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, followed a year later by the synagogue shooting in Poway, California, followed by several, and I mean several, less newsworthy incidents of anti-Semitic hate in her home state of New Jersey. Like gun violence writ large, blatant anti-Semitic attacks in America are becoming more normalized, and Horn knows what this portends. She drives home how, even through acknowledgement and recollection, the world sanitizes the stunning ugliness of anti-Semitic expulsions, crimes, and murders, even as they honor the Jewish history of a place, because to acknowledge the motivations behind them would reveal the grotesque truths about the perpetrators, including powerful entities like the church. As one reviewer put it, Horn reveals the subtle dehumanization built into the public piety that surrounds the Jewish past, making the radical argument that the benign reverence we give to past horrors is itself a profound affront to human dignity. Horn notes throughout her book how and why people who are not Jewish choose to understand anti-Semitism. They create Jewish heritage sites, perhaps out of respect, but more practically as a tourist attraction for two audiences. Number one, still living Jews who want to see Jewish history that has been decimated and lost for no apparent reason. I'm one of those. And number two, other people who are interested and maybe even love dead Jews. In her world travels to see remaining vestiges of Jewish life in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, she noted that when exhibits honor the great contributions that Jews made when they were there, never is the elephant in the room addressed. Why don't the Jews live here anymore? Why did they have to leave this place in the first place? Where did they go? But the fact that they're gone is simply a given because of geopolitical shifts that are the result of land grabs, wars, or said differently, because new pharaohs arose who chose not to know Joseph. One essay titled Everyone's Second Favorite Jew, you can guess who's the first, Horn highlights the absurdity of teaching people about the Holocaust through Anne Frank's story. Now, this is not a slight on Anne's talent as a writer. First, Horn notes that Anne's diary became popularized only after going through some serious sanitization in which the darker spots were edited out. That I did not know. I learned that from her book. Second, there were nearly 6 million other people that did not have a chance to write their stories or whose testimonies that did survive will never become bestsellers. The unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust, nearly 2 million people, at least 100 of my relatives included, marched to the forest, stripped naked, forced to dig the pits that would be their own graves. They are not captured in Anne's story. Those who suffocated in thousands of cattle cars on their way to death camps, those gassed to death upon arrival, those that suffered under unimaginable conditions in ghettos and camps until they dropped dead from starvation, disease, brutality, or suicide, the Jewish babies thrown into the air and shot for sport, they're not represented in Anne's diary. Horn argues that by focusing on Anne Frank as a Holocaust teaching tool, we protect nice people from having to learn about how jealousy, unbridled greed, brainwashing, psychosis, and subhuman violent tendencies can turn regular people into murderous monsters void of any compassion, who do not value life and seem to be comfortable destroying an entire civilization. It's better to focus on a few celebrated dead Jews. The second essay in her book, titled Frozen Jews, offers a complete history of how Harbin, China, a city of 10 million people and the capital of China's northernmost province, didn't really exist at all before the 1890s and was actually built by Jews with Jewish money. I was riveted by this history because of how fast-tracked it was. Jews began arriving there in the late 1890s, like 1898, and most were gone by World War II. They didn't even get one full generational run. They were all gone. All of them were gone by 55, except for one lady who refused to leave, and she died in 1985. Here's the quick story. By the end of the 19th century, Jews in Tsarist Russia were desperate to escape the country's poverty, pogroms, and institutionalized anti-Semitism. It was hard for them to get visas to leave the country, even within Russia. However, the economic winds and greed worked in their favor when the Tsar, who hated the Jews, remember Tevye? Rabbi, is there a blessing for the Tsar? You know, keep him far away from us. He hated the Jews. Had leased a land concession to China to build the Chinese Eastern Railroad across Manchuria as an extension of the cross-country Trans-Siberian line. Try to say that quickly 5 times. Once the tracks were laid, the Tsar was so eager to establish Russian economic stronghold along the route that he offered the Jews, who he hated and often tortured, a chance to live without restrictions if they moved to Manchuria. Now, who wouldn't say yes to that? Most of the Jews who braved the difficult journey to Harbin were either Ukrainians from the Pale of Settlement or Siberians. Both groups leaving behind everything they had known to settle in a harsh, freezing wasteland with no amenities. But they could live without oppression. Waves of Russian pogroms provided Harbin with a steady supply of Jewish residents, and many more Russian residents, both Jewish and Gentile, arrived after World War I. Early Jewish settlers turned Harbin from a ghost town with nothing into a gorgeous city with great institutions of learning, culture, and scientific advancement within a decade, all with their own money. By the mid-1920s, there were close to 20,000 Jews there. The one synagogue they built became so overcrowded they had to build a new synagogue. And then they became known as the Old Synagogue and the New Synagogue. Jews were furriers, bankers, bakers, shopkeepers, doctors, restaurateurs, teachers, and business owners of all kinds. Between 1918 and 1930, there were 20 different Jewish newspapers and periodicals published in Harbin, most written in Russian, but a few in Yiddish. All that, my friends, in 30 years. But alas, the inevitable happened very fast when the Russian Revolution brought scores of anti-Bolshevik White Russians to Harbin, along with a virulent strain of anti-Semitism. When the Japanese army invaded Manchuria to occupy Harbin in 1932, they began expropriating private property and terrorizing the civilian population. So these two forces combined, Russian anti-Semitism and Japanese terror attacks, worked in tandem to confiscate all the Jewish wealth in Harbin and dismantle the community. Some Jews were tortured and killed, but most left for Palestine or went south to Shanghai with nothing but the shirts on their backs. After World War II, there were only about 2,000 Jews left in Harbin, and they either made Aliyah to Israel or were repatriated back to Russia. But, economics drives everything. 50 years after the last Jewish family moved out of Harbin, in order to foster better economic ties with Israel, China's government decided in the early 2000s to restore the Jewish sites there, many still standing and repurposed, to attract tourists and build goodwill. A little more than 20 years ago, they invited an Israeli professor to lead the Sino-Israeli Research and Study Center. He's been the only Jew living in Harbin since 2002, except for the Hebrew University doctoral candidates that come there annually to do research. In the museum, you can see models of, literally, she describes this, a Jew at a desk working, like an accountant, or a Jew in prayer. There are gorgeous photos of the beautiful hotels and concert halls they built, but nowhere can you find an explanation about why they're not there anymore. Jews sometimes live in places for thousands or more years before they're forced to leave. In her chapter titled Dead Jews in the Desert, Horn remembers the Jewish communities that most of us have never even thought of visiting because we can't. Those in Pakistan, Syria, Egypt, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and everywhere else in the Middle East. We cannot even imagine the beauty and majesty of some of these ancient sites, most of which have been destroyed only in the last 70 years as a byproduct of civil and regional war. Because we've never been able to see them, it's hard to know what we've missed. But the real tragedy is that these vestiges of ancient Israel lasted well into the 20th and 21st century, long after Jews had had to leave. If only the Arab leaders had been mercenary like the Chinese and the Europeans and decided to refurbish Jewish heritage sites so that rich Jews from America could visit, they'd have made a fortune to add to their royal fortunes. Thousands of years of spiritual, intellectual, and artistic Jewish history that so many of us would have given anything to see, gone. Now, many people know that Jews were expelled from England in 1290 and were not able to return until the 1600s. And one reason that many people know this is because everybody's favorite cocktail conversation, one of our favorite cocktail conversations, is how was it possible for Shakespeare to write The Merchant of Venice if he never met a Jew? Well, Horn actually addresses that very myth in her chapter titled Commuting with Shylock. But I'm more interested in how the Jews got there in the first place, before they were killed and kicked out at the end of the 13th century. I'll give you the Cliff Notes. William the Conqueror invited wealthy Jews from France to settle in England beginning in 1070 after the Norman conquest. And the sole purpose, and he made no bones about this, was economic. Jews had money, and Jews could loan money. Christians could not. So these moneylenders who came from Normandy became essential to the country's economy. The British kings needed their wealthy Jews. They often exploited these Jews, but most kings protected their Jews against the church's growing anti-Semitism, born of jealousy, an inability to pay their debts, and bloody religious zealotry that fueled some of history's most well-known blood-libeled horrors. Every English city into which these Jews were invited, these educated, skilled Jews came. These cities were like London, Norwich, Lincoln. All of them prospered, without exception. Jews were doctors, goldsmiths, and poets, but their main function was money lending. There were notable outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence throughout the country in the late 12th century, in tandem with the Crusades throughout Christian Europe, and the death of Henry II when the crown was very weak. But once political turmoil subsided in 1194, things got better again for the Jews for many decades, even better than they were before. But anti-Semitism continued to foment, both for religious and economic reasons. So when the country was on the verge of economic collapse in the mid-1200s, Jews were punished for people's financial woes. Ultimately, Edward I buckled under pressure from the Parliament to forbid any further Jewish money lending, and he ultimately agreed because Parliament paid him a lot of money to expel the Jews entirely. That was in 1290. So next time you're at the cocktail party with the Merchant of Venice, you can give a little history. The first wave of English Jews were settled there for 220 years. At its height, the Jewish population in England was not much more than 3,000 people. They lived well in cities throughout the country. So imagine you're a little Jewish child born in England in 1101. You could have led an elite, privileged life under the protection of the king until your 80s without fear. You were educated, rich, and you could practice your religion as you pleased. Yet, it is almost impossible to find any remnant of England's medieval Jewish past, even though some of Britain's most treasured buildings and the wars that they fought with other countries were financed with Jewish capital. With Westminster Abbey, you can thank us. In April of this year, Richard Rubin published an article in the New York Times Magazine titled, "Turning Over the Stones of England's Lost Jewish Past," and in it he recounts, in March of 1190, the Jews of York got word that a mob was coming to murder them and loot their homes. They took refuge in York Castle's keep, but the mob surrounded it and demanded the Jews surrender and submit to baptism or die. Most chose death, and those who agreed to be baptized were actually slaughtered anyway upon leaving. York's entire Jewish community, some 150 people, was wiped out in a single day. Now that was the worst of 10 or more Jewish massacres that took place between 1189 and 1190. Not surprisingly, with renewed political stability, these Jewish communities actually bounced back and lived better than ever in the early 1200s. What is most noteworthy, however, is that the public histories of York Castle don't even mention this mass murder incident. The England that has existed for the last 800 years could not and would not be what it is had it not been for those 220 years that Jews lived there. And yet, it's a part of their history that no British citizen is taught about in school. One of the major controversies regarding California's ethnic studies curriculum is around the fact that Jewish contributions to building this state and some of its signature industries are not even acknowledged in the curriculum, let alone honored. You could say the same for Spain, a country that murdered and expelled their Jewish population that was so integrated into government, the economy, and culture for more than 7 centuries, and even there you have to dig for remnants of that lustrous and lengthy Jewish past. So I returned to my ancestor Jacob, that fugitive Aramean who came down to Egypt, few in number, and became a great and populous nation, upon whose backs formidable Egyptian kings built their empires. I remember the art history class I was attending when, during a lecture about Egyptian design, I innocently raised my hand and said, "But weren't those structures built by Israelite slaves?" And it was there that the teacher informed me matter-of-factly that there was no archaeological proof of that story, nothing written on some stele, no papyrus drawings in some mummy's tomb that shows Egyptians beating Israelites, nothing. Only the Torah recounts our essential role, starting with Joseph being summoned by Pharaoh to interpret his dreams and then amass his fortune in helping Egypt become and remain the leading empire in the ancient Near East for God knows how long. If we can barely find evidence of the incredible impact Jewish residents had in Spain or England 1,000 years ago, how in the world can we expect to even have a shred of proof in Egypt about the Israelite impact on Egyptian life more than 3,000 years ago? People loving dead Jews is a modern economic phenomenon that has emerged in a time when world travel and tourism to attract not yet dead Jews with money, that's us, to wax nostalgic about lost Jewish communities has become a lucrative industry. Throughout most of our history, people erased Jews, and we are only able to confirm what we know from written Jewish history when little shreds of evidence that lurk beneath the surfaces of the place that used us before they killed us. Here's an example, like a Jewish gravestone that was used for the foundation of a home built in England in the 1400s that was uncovered when the home was demolished in the early 2000s. They found this Jewish gravestone, like with the Hebrew inscriptions. Someone was like, "Oh, this was, Chaim Mitchik, whatever." But they, that's what the British used the monuments for. Or the Hebrew inscriptions left on the walls of buildings in southern Spain, only because the community was so poor they couldn't afford enough plaster to cover all the walls of all the Jewish holy spaces. To live Jewishly is an exercise in memory building and memory sharing. In pondering this useless question that I have, which is, had we known what a bitter end we would come to, would we have moved to place fill in the blank in the first place? And the answer will always be yes, because at the time, it is our best option. We learn from our memorialized past. We may never know exactly when, but we know what's coming. Like Jacob, we move in search of temporary safety for our families. We live with integrity. We share our bounty with our host society. And we hope that we'll get a few good centuries before it's time to leave. God willing, not in a body bag. 220 years ago in America, there were only about 2,000 Jews. By 1880, there were close to 250,000, and today, a little more than 5 million. Dara Horn feels the winds of change all around us, and she is alarmed because she knows what will inevitably happen here in America. Remember, our memories help us make sense of the world around us. They help us make predictions, good decisions, maintain a sense of self, and navigate our present. Our ancestors were able to thrive in foreign environments because of collective Jewish memory, and so will our descendants. We have no idea how long it's going to take, but with the undeniable erosion of democracy, both here and in Israel, happening before our very eyes, and by the way, the Torah, our prophets, and the rabbis have always acknowledged that Jews are, at times, serious party to their own demise. I would not be surprised if, within 50 to 100 years, Jews all over the world, including my children and my grandchildren, will be seeking new homes. While I cannot predict how we'll leave or when we'll go, though I do have good news, I was recently informed that the second largest totally kosher grocery store in the world is in Panama, I'm just saying. I'm strangely comforted by my Jewish history, laid out in the Torah and ingrained in the active memory as a Jew, that we will begin again wherever we go with whatever we have. More importantly, we will continue to be a Mamlechet Kohanim, a traveling band of godly agents who serve, a Goy Kadosh, a nation that models holiness, and an Am Segulah, a treasured people who even in the worst of man-made times have until this very day been remembered by God for life. I wish you all a Shana Tova, Tikatevu v'Techatemu. May we all be inscribed and sealed for one more year of fulfillment, productivity, and good health in safety.